What does silence truly sound like? Is it the absence of noise? Or is it something heavier, a presence all its own? For one man, buried deep in the Cascade Mountains, silence was a fortress he'd built for 36 years. But on a night when the wind screamed like a banshee, a sound no louder than a bird's feather tapping on glass was about to bring his entire world crashing down. Before we find out who's at the door, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss stories like this one. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's step into the storm. Liam O'Connell had lived 36 years on this earth, and the last 5 had carved lines into his face deeper than any winter. He was a man built of the mountains themselves, shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the sky, hands like granite that could split a log with a single focused blow. But the people in the small town of Northwood, nestled in the valley below, spoke of his silence before they spoke of his size. He was a ghost in the pines, a widower whose grief had settled into a quiet so profound it felt like a physical presence. His wife, gone too soon, still lived in the empty spaces of his cabin, the rocking chair by the hearth that never moved, the hook by the door where her coat used to hang, the other half of the bed that remained cold and untouched. He kept his world small, his words few, and his heart locked away in a fortress of solitude. That evening the air was thick and heavy, pressing down with the smell of pine and the promise of a blizzard. The wind had begun to howl through the eaves, a mournful sound that usually soothed the ache in Liam's chest. But tonight, another sound broke through the storm's roar. It wasn't the rattle of a loose shutter or the groan of a snow-laden branch. It was a knock, sharp, hurried, and trembling. Liam paused, a log held halfway to the fire, every instinct honed by years of solitude coming to life. No one came to his door after dark, not in winter, not without a desperate reason. He set the log down with a quiet thud and moved to the door, his hand resting on the iron latch. He pulled it open, and the wind tore into the warmth of the cabin. There on his porch stood a girl, no older than 7, looking as small and fragile as a lost sparrow. Snow clung to her tangled hair, and her cheeks were blotched a painful red with cold. She wore a dress too thin for a summer evening, let alone a winter gale, its hem torn and muddy. Her boots were so worn that her small toes peeked through, raw and exposed. But it was her eyes that held him captive. They were wide, not just from the cold, but from a fear that had settled deeper than the frost, a fear that had burned away all her tears. She looked up at the giant of a man silhouetted in the doorway and whispered words that hung in the frozen air like smoke. They hurt my mom. She's sick." The words struck the heavy silence of Liam's cabin and shattered it. For a long moment he didn't move. The girl's lips trembled, but she stood with a desperate dignity that no child should ever have to learn, holding herself together as if the slightest movement would cause her to crumble. "Who's your mom, little one?" Liam asked, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. She swallowed hard. Sarah Vance. They left her at the old fishing shack, down by Whisper Creek. She can't get up. Please, sir. Please help her. Sarah Vance." The name snagged on a memory. He'd seen her in Northwood, a woman with soft features and eyes that were always downcast, especially when her husband, Rick Thorne, was near. Rick was a man with a voice too loud and fists too ready. Liam recalled seeing him in the general store once barking at Sarah, his hand raised just a little too high, and she had wilted like a flower under a boot heel. Liam had turned away, as most people did, clinging to the unspoken rule that you don't meddle in another man's home, no matter how cruel it seems. But now, hearing her name from the lips of her terrified child, that old shame pierced him deeper than the winter wind. He crouched down, the porch boards groaning under his weight, trying to make his great height less intimidating. "What's your name?" "Lily," she whispered. He saw the fresh bruises on her small arms, the way she clutched the torn sleeve of her dress. Something hardened inside him, not a loud, burning anger, but a quiet, cold fury that ran deep, like fire in the roots of an ancient tree. He had built this fortress of silence to keep the pain of the world out, but this child had just walked right through the gates. "Get inside," he told her, his voice gentle but firm. She hesitated for a second. Then a gust of wind nearly knocked her over, and she scurried past him into the warmth of the cabin. Liam pulled his heavy coat on, his jaw set like stone, and strode out into the night, his boots carving a steady path into the heart of the storm. The journey to Whisper Creek was a battle against the elements. The snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, and the wind clawed at him. But Liam moved with a certainty born from a lifetime in these woods. He carried no lantern. The map of this land was etched into his bones. The old fishing shack came into view as a sagging silhouette against the swirling white, a ruin of rotting logs and broken shingles. He pushed the door open, and it groaned on rusted hinges, revealing a scene of damp decay and the stale stench of whiskey. In the corner, on a pallet of filthy rags, lay Sarah Vance. Even in the gloom, her injuries told a brutal story. One cheek was swollen and purpled like a dying plum, her eye nearly swollen shut. Her lip was split, and her arms bore the dark marks of a man's rough grip, her wrists raw and chafed. Yet when she managed to lift her head, her gaze wasn't pleading. It was proud, steady, as if she would rather die on that dirt floor than beg for mercy. Liam's massive shadow filled the small, wretched space. Sarah's voice was a hoarse, thin whisper. "You shouldn't have come. He'll ruin you. They'll say things." He knelt slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath him, and looked into her bruised face. "Let them say," he murmured. With a tenderness that seemed impossible for his size, he slid his arms beneath her, lifting her as though she weighed nothing at all. Her breath hitched, a small gasp of pain or surprise, but she didn't protest. She closed her eyes either from shame or from the strange, forgotten feeling of being held with care. He wrapped his own coat around her slight frame and carried her out into the blizzard, her head resting against the solid wall of his chest. Back at the cabin, Lily ran to the door, her small face a mask of anxiety. When she saw her mother safe in Liam's arms, a wave of relief so profound washed over her that it made her seem both years older and younger at the same time. He carried Sarah inside and laid her gently on his own bed, the only bed in the cabin. She stirred, whispering that she couldn't take his place, but he quieted her with a slow shake of his head. Lily immediately climbed onto the bed beside her mother, tucking herself into her side, a tiny anchor in a sea of turmoil. Liam moved to the hearth, stoking the fire until it roared to life, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. He fetched water and tore clean cloth, and with his rough but careful hands, he began to clean Sarah's wounds. She winced but never cried out, her resilience a silent testament to what she had endured. He worked in a quiet that spoke more than words ever could. Each gentle touch, each careful gesture carried an unspoken promise. You are safe here. No one will hurt you again. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the world in a pristine, silent white. But inside the cabin, a fragile warmth began to take root. In the days that followed, the three of them moved around each other like strangers bound by a shared storm. Liam rose before dawn, his routine now expanded to include tending to two fragile souls. He prepared simple food, oatmeal and broth, with a clumsy focus, setting the bowl beside Sarah's bed without a word. She would murmur her thanks, and he would simply nod, retreating to his chair by the fire, as if afraid his very presence might overwhelm her. Lily, ever watchful, slowly began to venture from her mother's side. She watched Liam's giant hands split firewood with precision. She watched the way his shoulders seemed to hold up the roof of the cabin itself. A quiet trust began to form, unspoken but real. One evening, as he sat by the fire, Liam wordlessly held out a small object to her. It was a bird, whittled from a piece of pine, its wings poised for flight. Lily took it with a reverence usually reserved for treasure, holding it tight in her small hand. It was more than a toy. It was a nonverbal promise of freedom, a symbol of hope carved by a man who had forgotten what hope felt like. From that moment on, she saw him not as a giant, but as a guardian. Sarah noticed these small exchanges, though shame still pressed on her, heavier than any of Rick's blows. To be a burden, to be in another man's home, she knew what the gossips in Northwood would make of it. She had heard their whispers long before, the clucking tongues judging her for not leaving him. Now their words would be sharper, crueler. The thought settled on her like a layer of frost. As she regained her strength, she began to move about the cabin, sweeping the floor, mending Liam's worn shirts with neat, careful stitches. These were not acts of repayment, but of reclaiming her own purpose, of turning this shelter from a place of refuge into a temporary home. Liam would find himself pausing in his chores, listening to her soft humming, a sound that seemed to knit the very walls of the cabin together, filling the lonely silence he had cultivated for so long. While a fragile peace settled within the cabin walls, the outside world grew sharper and more hostile. In the local tavern in Northwood, Rick Thorne's voice rang loud and bitter. His pride, stung far deeper than his fists had ever struck, fueled a torrent of venom. He told anyone who would listen that the reclusive giant, Liam O'Connell, had stolen his wife, that she belonged to him, and that no man could hide her away from him. Some men laughed and mocked him, while others, eager for drama, fed his fury. The whispers spread through the town like a contagion, painting Sarah as a shameless, fallen woman and Liam as a predator who had taken advantage of her. Liam felt the weight of the town's judgment every time he rode in for supplies. Eyes followed him. Conversations faltered as he passed. Women on their porches would pause their sewing, their glances sliding across his back like knives. He said nothing, letting his lifelong silence be his armor. But the coldness of their stares was a stark contrast to the warmth he returned to in the cabin. A warmth filled with Lily's tentative laughter and Sarah's quiet humming. One morning, needing medical supplies for Sarah's lingering injuries, Liam decided they had to go to town. Sarah resisted, her hand clutching Lily's. "They will stare," she whispered, her voice trembling. Liam met her gaze, his own dark eyes steady and unyielding. "Let them." And so she dressed in a simple shawl, hiding the worst of the fading bruises on her face, and climbed into his truck, her daughter pressed close beside her. The Northwood General Store fell silent the moment they walked in. The low murmur of conversation died, replaced by a thick, judgmental quiet. People turned away, busying themselves with shelves, their disapproval a palpable force in the air. As Sarah waited by the counter, a woman named Brenda, the town's self-appointed moral authority, cornered her. Her smile was too sweet to be kind. "My dear," she began, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "It must be so hard to endure such trials. But perhaps it would be more fitting if you found a more appropriate arrangement. People are talking, you know." The thinly veiled suggestion, to go back to her abuser to quiet the gossip, made Sarah's blood run cold. Before she could find her voice, Liam's shadow fell over them both. He didn't say a word. He simply stood there, his towering presence a silent, immovable wall. His gaze, heavy and direct, settled on Brenda. Her saccharine smile faltered. She muttered something about prayers and scurried away, her disapproval defeated by a silence more powerful than any rebuke. The town's judgment was a form of complicity, a system that protected the abuser by shaming the victim into silence. In that moment, Liam's defiance wasn't just against Rick. It was against the entire town that enabled him. That night, back in the safety of the cabin, Sarah sat by the fire, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I've brought ruin upon you," she whispered, the weight of the day pressing down on her. "They'll never forgive this." Liam looked up from the piece of wood he was carving. His voice, when it came, was slow and steady. "It isn't their forgiveness I'm after. It's peace," her breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not as something broken to be pitied, not as property to be owned, but as a person worthy of peace. The words reframed everything. He wasn't acting out of charity or desire. He was acting from a deep, unshakable principle. A warmth crept into her face, and she turned away quickly to hide it. For years her life had been about survival, about enduring. But in his simple statement, she saw the possibility of something more. An ember of defiance long dormant within her began to glow, fanned by the quiet strength of the man who had offered her shelter from the storm, both outside and within. The fragile peace was shattered a few days later. As Liam returned from checking his fence lines, he found a message on his front door. The words were crudely scrawled in angry black spray paint. "She's mine. I'm coming for her." The threat was no longer a drunken boast in a tavern. It was a promise delivered to his doorstep. At the same time, the sky began to darken, and the blizzard, which had briefly eased, returned with a vengeance. The wind rose to a piercing shriek, and snow began to fall in a blinding whiteout, turning the world outside into a churning vortex of white. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a besieged fortress, trapping them with a danger that was drawing ever closer. Inside, the atmosphere grew thick with tension. Sarah moved with a quiet urgency, shuttering the windows, her hands trembling slightly but her movements steady. Lily, sensing the fear, clung to her mother's skirt, clutching the small wooden bird Liam had carved for her. Each howl of the wind outside made the child press closer, her wide eyes fixed on her mother's face. As dusk fell, turning the swirling snow outside into a gray twilight, a new sound cut through the storm's roar. It wasn't the sound of nature. It was the angry mechanical whine of two-stroke engines. The noise grew louder, a violation of the forest's deep silence. Liam moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the shutter. Two unnatural predatory beams of light cut through the blizzard, the headlights of powerful snowmobiles. They were a modern, aggressive intrusion into this timeless, natural sanctuary, just as Rick was a violation of Sarah's safety. He counted 3 figures, pushing hard against the storm. One voice rose above the wind, loud, angry, and slurred with alcohol. It was Rick Thorne. Liam stepped back from the window, his face carved from stone. He turned to Sarah, his voice low but firm, cutting through her rising panic. "Get Lily into the back room. Bolt the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." She hesitated for a heartbeat, wanting to protest, but the command in his eyes left no room for argument. She gathered Lily into her arms, whispering assurances she didn't feel herself, and hurried the child into the small back bedroom, the soft click of the bolt sounding unnervingly loud in the tense silence. Liam remained in the main room. He looked at the rifle propped against the wall but didn't reach for it. A rifle signified lethal force, an escalation he was unwilling to make. Instead, he moved to the table and lit an old kerosene lantern. It was a deliberate, almost ceremonial act. He was not choosing to meet violence with violence, but darkness with light. Holding the lantern, its warm glow casting his great shadow across the room, he unbarred the heavy wooden door and stepped out onto the porch. Snow and wind burst inward, but Liam stood firm, holding the light aloft. The men on the snowmobiles flinched at the sudden brightness, their faces raw from the cold, their eyes red-rimmed with drink and rage. Rick sat on his machine, his body bloated with fury, his mouth twisted into a sneer. "O'Connell," he roared, "you think you can hide what's mine? You've shamed me. Send her out or we'll burn this place to the ground." Cruel laughter followed from the other 2 men, a sound that was quickly swallowed by the gale. Liam stepped forward, the storm clawing at his coat, the lantern in his hand casting long dancing shadows. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, yet it carried with impossible clarity through the howl of the wind. "She was never yours to break." The words struck harder than any physical blow. They were a declaration of Sarah's humanity, a flat rejection of Rick's possessive worldview. For a moment, Rick was stunned into silence. Then his face contorted and rage boiled over. He spurred his machine forward, screaming to his cronies, "Get her!" Liam calmly set the lantern down in the snow, freeing his hands. The storm whipped around them, snow stinging their faces like tiny knives, the night alive with a fury both natural and man-made. The battle for the small cabin in the pines had begun. The fight on the porch was brutal, chaotic, and mercifully brief. Rick's 2 cronies stumbled forward, but they were drunk and clumsy, their aggression no match for Liam's focused power. He was not a brawler. He moved with the grim economic precision of a man who splits logs for a living, using their own momentum against them. A heavy shove sent one man sprawling into a deep snowdrift. A quick, disabling blow sent the other staggering back to his machine, clutching his arm. The fight was not glorious. It was a necessary, ugly task, and he dispatched them with cold efficiency. Then, it was just him and Rick. Rick came at him with the wild, sloppy rage of a man terrified of his own weakness, his fists flailing. Liam met him with the controlled strength of a man protecting something sacred. He absorbed Rick's frantic blows, his body a bulwark against the pathetic storm of Rick's fury. The struggle was a dance in the swirling snow, one man fighting to possess, the other fighting to protect. Finally, Liam caught Rick by the collar of his coat, his massive hand closing around the fabric, and slammed him hard against a porch post. The heavy timber shuddered, and snow cascaded from the roof. Rick gasped for air, blood trickling from his split lip, but his eyes still burned with a venomous hatred. "Do it!" he hissed, a broken sneer on his face. "Break me, kill me. Prove you're the monster everyone in town thinks you are." For a split second, as the storm raged around them, the temptation was there. The hot primal urge for vengeance burned in Liam's chest. But then, through a momentary lull in the wind, another sound reached him. It was faint, muffled by the cabin walls, but unmistakable. It was Lily's voice, a child's soft cry. "Mommy?" That single word pierced through his anger and broke the spell. It was a reminder of why he was fighting. Killing Rick wouldn't be justice. It would be a surrender. It would make him the very thing he was fighting against and would only birth another ghost to haunt Sarah and her daughter. True strength wasn't the power to destroy. It was the restraint to protect. He lowered his fist. He had not only defeated Rick physically, he had refused to be dragged down to his level. He yanked Rick forward and threw him down into the snow. He then hauled the sputtering man to his feet and half dragged, half threw him toward his snowmobile. Rick's men watched, cowed and silent. "Tell the sheriff in Northwood I'll be in to file a report at dawn," Liam said, his voice cold and final. "If you ever come near them again, there isn't a storm in these mountains that can hide you." He watched them go, their engine sounds fading until they were completely swallowed by the now quieting storm. He stood for a long moment in the snow, his chest rising and falling, before turning and stepping back inside the cabin. The warmth that met him felt different now. The firelight was gentle, peaceful. Sarah stood near the hearth, her face pale but her eyes fierce and shining with unshed tears. The moment Liam shut the door, sealing out the cold, Lily ran from the back room and wrapped her small arms tightly around his leg. "You saved us," she whispered into the rough fabric of his pants. He bent down and lifted her gently into his arms. She curled into his chest as if it were the safest place on earth and fell asleep there, her small hand still clutching the wooden bird. Sarah watched, a hand rising to her mouth, not to hide shame, but to stifle a sob of pure, unadulterated relief. The heavy, lonely silence that had once defined Liam's existence was gone. In its place was a new kind of quiet, a shared, peaceful silence, full of unspoken understanding and the promise of a new beginning. The storm outside had ended, but for the three souls inside the small cabin, bathed in the warm glow of the fire, the real journey, the one towards healing, had only just begun. If this story moved you, please show your support by hitting the like button, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing for more tales of the human spirit. You can also check out the playlist on your screen for other stories like this one. Your support is what keeps this fire burning. Thank you for listening.